Yeah, so now we can start. So, dear friends, welcome to our interview. I'm delighted to see so many of you here. Today we have a great honor of speaking with Margaret Macmillan, who is a renowned historian, a professor of the University of Oxford, and expert in history and international relationships. Margaret, thank you very much for taking time to meet with us, to join this interview. We very appreciate it. And the topic of today's interview and the topic of your research is particularly relevant for us Ukrainians, as you know. So yeah, many thanks for agreeing on this interview, and I'm really grateful for that serendipitous moment of meeting you at Ukrainian Catholic University, and for that people who introduced us to one another, because now we have this chance to speak. So if you'd like to say a few words before we start, feel free. And after that, we will jump straight to our interview.
Thank you, Marta. And it's a pleasure to see you again, and a pleasure to be even remotely connected to Ukraine and to Lviv. I have many happy memories of my trip there last fall and the very warm welcome I got. And it is a pleasure to be doing this interview, and it's an honor. And I thank you all for taking the time when you have so much else to think about. And I will do my best. I know you have a list of questions, so I'll do my best to answer them.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. So let's get started. And I'd like to start from the very beginning, from the word. And in your book, you discuss how societies often try to soften or even amend the word war, using terms like conflict, intervention, or even special military operation instead. And I want to ask, why do we hesitate to call war what it is? And do words hold any power in this context? And does this influence our perception of events from the historical perspective?
I think war has a very clear meaning, although we tend to use it as a metaphor for lots of things. So we talk about a war on drugs or a war on obesity, but it is a very specific human activity. It's a highly organized activity, an application of force by one group of people to another group of people to get them to do what they want. As Clausewitz said, war is intended to compel your enemy to do your will, and it involves conflict, it involves brutality, it involves killing, it involves cruelty. And so I suppose nations that are carrying out acts of aggression try and hide what they're doing or try and convince themselves they're not making war. And so, yes, you're right. They talk about things like they often call it a police action, as if somehow it makes it better, or a special military operation. I think for a very long time, and you can correct me, I think the Russians did not use the term war or invasion for what they were doing in Ukraine. They simply said it was a special military operation. But I think we should call it what it is. It is something that human beings have done an awful lot of. And I think we need to understand just what is involved in it. And just at bottom, at base, what it is an act of force involving all sorts of methods, including the most brutal and the most cruel, to bring about a result that you want, to get your enemy to do what you want.
Yeah, thank you. So as far as I know, Russia still uses this term special military operation, even though like the world now calls it the war. And I also would like to ask how does this kind of linguistic manipulation affects both domestic and international perception?
I don't think most of the world is deceived by the terminology the Russians are using. I mean, what they are doing is an invasion, it's an occupation, it's an act of unprovoked aggression, it's a war. And possibly the Russian people, who have less access to free information and to unbiased information than many other people, perhaps they can think that what is happening is only a police action. And perhaps they even believe some of the excuses that the Russian government has given for its unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. I mean, the excuse that, I mean, you know them all. I mean, they're ludicrous, that Ukraine had fallen into the hands of a group of fascists, or Ukraine was run by drug-addicted maniacs. I mean, all these sort of stories, and the misuse of history, that Ukraine had always been part of Russia, for centuries and centuries. perhaps the Russian people believe it, but I think most people in the world see it for what it is, see Russia's action for what it is. It is a war that Russia is making by choice. It's Russia's choice. It's not Ukraine's choice on Ukraine.
Thank you. Yeah, so probably that's like for domestic usage. They still use this term. I also want to talk a little bit more about the nature of war and ask you, what is this so-called tribe of war? So what drives people to go to war? Is it some kind of primarily social construct, or does it have deeper biological roots? So you mention it in your books. So I suppose you've talked to anthropologists and other experts about it. And could you please share your insights on this matter?
Well, it's an important question, and one about which there's much debate. And there are those who say, well, it's just human nature. We've been endowed by our hereditary natures, by evolution, with an impulse to aggression. And I just don't think that's explanation enough. We've been given a lot of things as a result of evolution. We've also been given a capacity for altruism, for helping others, for sacrificing ourselves for others. We've been given a capacity for building communities. We have a number of things that are part of our human nature. But what war is a very conscious act, and it's a very highly organized act. And I once talked to an anthropologist about this, and he said it is probably the most organized of all human activities. Because what you want in war, if you're making war, you presumably want to be successful. You don't go to war hoping to lose. You go to war hoping to win. And if you make war, you have to be highly organized. You don't want a mob of soldiers rushing across the field, not obeying orders, getting themselves killed unnecessarily. I mean, you see, well, for example, we've seen recently just how ineffective, badly led and badly trained troops, such as the North Koreans, who were thrown in to a war without any proper preparation, have been sacrificed. And that doesn't help you to gain what you want if you're making a war. And so war is actually something that involves a very high degree of organization. And the training for war, I mean, one of the reasons it often takes so long, I think it always takes so long to train soldiers to be effective soldiers, or the same thing goes for pilots, or the same thing goes for sailors. It takes so long because often the training has to overcome their natural impulse to preserve themselves. And so you are training soldiers, for example, to obey orders on the battlefield, even if it means putting their own lives in danger, and even if it means doing things they don't want to do, such as killing other people. And so war, I think, is something that is very much socially constructed. And it is a product of all sorts of training, all sorts of psychological insights. I mean, psychologists have played a very important part in the 20th century in trying to prepare those who will fight. And I think we also see that in certain societies, you have societies which are more warlike than others. Some societies which value military behavior, value discipline, value the ability to sacrifice yourself for a cause. And so those societies, perhaps in those societies like Sparta, ancient Sparta, for example, it is easier to persuade young men to fight. Usually it has been traditionally young men, but we now have young women too. And you have other societies in which peace is a much greater value, and military virtues such as discipline and the willingness to obey orders are not respected or not valued as highly. And so social values, as well as the actual training imposed by the military themselves, plays a very important part, I think, in whether a nation is ready to go to war or not, and whether its leaders are ready to use war or not. I mean, there's some nations that don't want to use war at all, and others, such as Russia, that are quite prepared to use it as a tool of state.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very interesting point, because we often think about this tribe of war from the psychological perspective, especially psychoanalytical perspective. So what is this tribe of war? And it's very nice to have this different opinions to have a full picture, if there is a full picture at all. So yeah, sorry.
No, I was thinking we often talk about people being turned into soldiers. You know, he went away, she went away, they did their training, they were turned into soldiers, or they were turned into sailors or pilots. And that suggests that people are transformed through the experience of becoming part of the military, or can be transformed.
So talking about this transformation and like some kind of societal organization and violence. In your book, you mention Steven Pinker and his research suggesting that societies are becoming less and less violent. And by the way, we actually had a similar interview with Steven Pinker, but we were discussing freedom of speech and cancel culture. But getting back to our questions, so it seems like we've created laws that not only protect people, but also animals and nature and different resources. And I generally deeply agree with this idea. But living next to Russia and witnessing its action makes me question this theory, makes me question it whether it's true or at all. And I want to ask, do you follow this theory, or maybe you see it not as a like progressive linear process, but rather a cyclic one where society fluctuates between kindness, compassion, organization, and violence?
I think we can have both at once, because I think you can have societies which are law-abiding and where there are authorities who will help to limit violence. I mean, I think the introduction of police forces in much of the world in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries was very important in that. It meant that there was less random violence, less violence at a local level where people simply took affairs into their own hands, that increasingly there were ways of stopping those who would use violence against others, ways that were supported by the state. And so, yes, I think we've built institutions and we've built a web of laws. And we've also built international laws. I mean, we have all sorts of international treaties and conventions about how peoples must be treated, how people in war zones must be treated. The trouble is we have the other side of it, in which we have those who are prepared to break those rules, prepared to ignore them. And I think we see a great deal still in the world, in certain societies, of what I would call not random violence. I'm trying to think of violence carried out by people without any intervention by any authorities. I mean, you often, in certain societies, if you look at what's happening in parts of the Great Lakes district in Africa now, the ghastly stories coming out of Goma, it's quite clear there is no superior authority which can put an end to the violence that's happening to, for example, women at the moment. And so I think we have a world in which we have both sorts of things happening. We have a drive towards greater control, and it means control, greater control by the state, more use of state authorities to prevent violence. You often have communities too setting up their own protection if necessary to try and protect themselves against violence. But we also have those parts of the world where violence is still accepted, where there is no overriding authority. And we still have war. And I think there is a real distinction between the highly organized nature of war, which involves very specific goals, very specific types of force, and the sort of not random violence, but the sort of uncontrolled violence that we see often in personal relations. And there's a fine line between them. And you will often get violent gangs, for example, beginning to behave more and more like armies with a sort of internal discipline. So it's not a clear-cut distinction, but I do think, yes, societies are often in the West, for example, getting more peaceable. We tolerate violence less. We have authorities who will deal with it. We have police forces. We have general sort of feeling against violence, but we're still seeing a lot of very organized violence in the shape of war. I mean, there are several wars going on in the world at the moment. There's been a war in the world pretty much every year since the end of the Second World War. And I don't see that ending anytime soon.
And can you maybe tell what is the cause of that some societies are becoming less and less violent, while some others continue to? Maybe there's some kind of explanation to that.
I think it's partly geography. It's partly their cultural values. It can be sometimes their religions. It may be their history. I mean, societies can be very different one from the other. And so I think that affects it. And you can have societies which are peaceable at home but use violence abroad. The United States has a rule of law, but the United States has also taken part in military actions around the world in the course of the 20th and 21st centuries. So being peaceable at home doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be peaceful abroad. Again, there is this distinction between the organized nature of war. And unfortunately, a lot of states in the world, and I think the number may be growing, see war as something they can use to their own advantage, or those who lead those states see war as something they can use to their own advantage. And so you have people in positions of authority who think I can use a war to get what I want, whether that's more territory, whether it's more resources, whether it's prestige, whatever. I think we have this unfortunate tendency of leaders of certain types of societies, often dictatorships, to think that war will get them what they want. Of course, it often doesn't. I mean, the thing about war, among other things that I think we should all remember, including dictators, is you never know where it's going to go. You know, once it starts, it's unpredictable. And it's very difficult to predict. You can't predict what's going to happen. You think you can. And wars are often very difficult to end. Once started, they take on their own momentum.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your answer. So in this interview, I would like to focus on your work and your research and how we can apply it to Ukraine and the situation we're in. But however, I need to ask a few questions about Russia. And I would like to discuss Russia's past wars and what principles guided its actions back then. And can we apply the same principles to the war we have now?
I don't think the past ever repeats itself. And I think we have to remember that countries and societies change. And the Russia of today is in some ways similar to the Tsarist Russia, perhaps in some ways similar to the Soviet Russia. But it's also, excuse me, a different sort of society. Far more people, for example, are educated. Far more people have contact with sources of contact with others across the country. And so I think that it is a different sort of society. But I think you can see certain similarities. Geography is always an important factor. You know, if you don't have very secure borders, you want to think of ways of protecting them. We live in Canada next door to the United States, and so far we haven't had to protect our border because the United States and Canada have established a way of getting on with each other. But Russia, I think, for centuries has always felt that it's vulnerable, whether it's to forces like the Mongols coming from the east, or whether it's forces coming from the west, such as Napoleon's forces or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, so that it has always had this push to try and make its borders more secure and to push out. The trouble is, the more you push out, the more enemies you have, or the more threats you have, the more you have to worry about. And I do think that is a fairly constant factor. I mean, I think there are other things as well. I mean, I think there are the identification of rulers with the state, where it becomes a matter of pride and prestige for the ruler to have a very big and powerful state. I mean, I believe that Putin has been heard to say, and certainly Stalin once said, that we want to get back the borders that we had under the Tsars. You know, these are our natural borders. These belong to us. I mean, Ukraine is right, of course, in the middle of that. And so there are, I think, geographical factors. There are historical factors. History can provide a very strong example. I mean, I think it's a great burden for a country to have a very powerful past. I think the French, in a way, have always tried to live up to the times when, under Louis XIV and Napoleon, they dominated Europe. Canada's lucky. We've never been very powerful. And so we don't have that burden. We're not trying to catch something that we thought we had in the past. I mean, we simply are trying at the moment to deal with the United States, which is enough problem under the United States under Trump. But I do think with Russia and with other countries, geography matters, the nature of the society matters, the ways in which that society is run, who's in control. And dictatorships or authoritarian states don't always go to war, but I think they're more likely to fall into the trap of thinking that war is cheap and war is easy. The great problem, I think, psychologically, that dictators have is that the longer they're in power, the more they become convinced that they're right. And the harder it becomes for them to listen to anyone who disagrees with them. And I think we see this in the case of your neighbor, Russia, under President Putin. Who would dare tell him that he is wrong? Who would have told him before he invaded Ukraine that it was a stupid thing to do? But I do think dictatorships are more likely to be aggressive against their neighbors than democracies, because in democracies, there's always a check on that person in power or those persons in power.
Yeah, thank you very much for such a big answer. You've actually anticipated one of my next questions about the causes of war, why Russia starts their wars. So yeah, I think if you'd like to add something more about these factors, you sure can. But we can move to other question if.
Well, if I may, I'd just like to add one or two things. It is partly, I mean, I think people will often make war if they think it's going to be easy and cheap. And all the evidence is that Putin thought the war would be over in a week. You know, the fact that the Russian officers, many of them had brought their dress uniforms with them for the victory parade, suggests that the Russians were thinking this. And I've heard, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've heard that high up people in the FSB had already chosen which apartments they were going to take over in Kyiv when the Russians had installed a puppet government. So, but you know, I think it's a temptation if you think it's going to be easy and cheap. I think also, especially in societies that have dictators, the prestige and the power of the dictator, him or herself, becomes very important, and it becomes a matter of pride. But I think in the case also, Ukraine had resources, Ukraine has minerals, but it also has its famous black earth. I mean, without Ukraine, Russia is poorer. And I think that is something that the Russians are aware of. And I think finally, there was the example of Ukraine. I mean, here was a country moving towards greater democracy, a more open and free society, sitting right next to Russia. Putin didn't want the Russians seeing something like that. It was a reproach to what was going on in Russia. And so I think there were a number of motives that came into it, including his own personal pride and prestige, which has resulted in this dreadful situation.
Thank you. So Russia's war against Ukraine has been also called 21st century war of imperial aggression. And I want to ask, do you agree with this statement? And how do you see its historical importance compared to past empires and colonial struggle? And would you say that this kind of imperialistic thinking holds a particular significance in modern wars in general?
Well, I think, you know, it's a very interesting question, because I think we thought that with the disappearance of most of the Western empires after the Second World War, the age of imperialism was over. And I think we somehow forgot that imperialism has been with us for a very long time. And it may change its name, it may change its look, but it's still there. And Russia was the last of the European empires to hang on to its territory. I mean, Russia, as the Soviet Union, was an imperial nation ruling over different peoples that it had conquered, many of which it had conquered in the course of the 19th century. And Russia never lost its empire. It remained an empire. It called itself a Soviet Union, and then it called itself Russia. But if you actually look at how it was constituted and how many minorities there were within the borders of what became Russia, then it is still an imperial power. And I think its rulers still think in an imperial way, that those around their borders are peoples who need to be managed for Russia's sake. I think there's often an element of feeling that these peoples are inferior, they aren't as glorious as Russians, they aren't as important as Russians, and therefore Russia has a right to rule over them. So in many ways, I think Russia is still a classic 19th century imperial power. But we have other examples of imperialism in the world today. I mean, China, I think, is an imperial power. If you look at the way it's absorbed Tibet, the way it treats the people in the Uyghur in Xinjiang. And now, of course, we have someone who's an outright imperialist in the White House, who talks about the United States taking over territories around its borders. And so we're seeing a revival openly of the idea of imperialism, which never really went away. We thought it had, but here we are back with imperialism again.
Yeah, I agree with you. So it is well known, and you also mention it in your books, that states go to war in order to expand their territory, their access to resources, their influence, which in turn results in improvement of lives of their citizens. And can we observe that wars in Russia have improved the lives of Russians?
Well, wars don't always improve the lives of their citizens, and imperialism doesn't always improve the lives of the imperial power. You know, often some of the colonies that the Europeans took in the 19th century, they ended up subsidizing. Germany, for example, never made anything out of its colonies. It ended up paying for them. And so there was no direct benefit to the German people. There was benefit to certain Germans who were involved in trade and investment and so on. So I don't think imperialism always benefits the metropolitan power, the power that controls the colonies. And in the case of Russia, it hasn't benefited Russia. It has damaged the Russian economy. I don't think we realize, and perhaps we will never know the full extent of the damage done to the Russian economy, but inflation is clearly growing. The sanctions have damaged Russia. The Russians have lost a lot of their talented and educated young people. And I'm not sure Russia is ever going to really recover from that. And Russia is now much more dependent on China, which is not something any Russian leader should want. You know, and given the fact that the Chinese have not forgotten, I think the Russians remember it too, that a lot of the territory that Russia has in the Far East, which it took in the 19th century, is territory that China feels really properly should be Chinese. And so Russia, as a result of the war in Ukraine, has ended up much more weakened economically, but also much more dependent on China. China now very much has the upper hand. And I think in the long run, that is going to cost Russia very dearly indeed.
Yeah, thank you. My next question is rather hypothetical. Can a state achieve unity without going to war? And what factors influence this process? And was there ever a chance for us as a society, as a state, to find its cohesion through any other ways? Or was this war inevitable for our development as a democracy?
Oh, I don't think the war is necessary for development as a democracy. But what a war will do is focus, I think, your attention on what's really important. And I think what happened in Ukraine was even those who were opposed to the government, and you know, the government was being heavily criticized at the time of the invasion, and not everyone supported it, saw the importance of having a united nation to resist the aggression. And I think that has been, you know, an important factor. It's probably speeded up the development of Ukrainian nationalism and the development of Ukraine as a more democratic nation as well. I mean, I think wars can bring about positive changes, but there are other ways of doing it. But it is occasionally true, I think, that a moment of crisis suddenly makes you try and work out what's valuable to you and what isn't. And if I can just, I mean, it's not the same situation at all, but in Canada, there has been a very interesting, very quick reaction to Trump's threat to make us the 51st state of the United States. Suddenly Canadians, the number of Canadians who think Canada is a very good country has jumped by 10% in about 2 weeks. And it's continuing to go up. And the number of Canadians who do not want to be part of the United States, I think, is now around 80 or 90%. And people are surprising themselves. You go into shops in Toronto now and there's signs saying this is Canadian produce. People are not buying American things. So it's not that this is something we would desire, but occasionally that crisis will make you think what is really important to me and value what you have when you might grumble about it in more peaceful times, as you should be able to. But occasionally a crisis will bring about this sort of recognition that we have to work together on this.
Yeah, I think that's actually what's happening to us right now. I feel that we are really united now. Maybe not in all ways, but more united than ever, probably. So yeah, at great cost, of course. But yeah, I totally agree with you. So my next block of question is going to be around global perspective. So I'd like to ask you, what has this war taught the world, especially the Western world, with its long history of peace and pacifistic narratives, and maybe even in some ways a little bit spoiled by this sense of security? Do you think their perspective has shifted, and their general perception of war as well?
Well, I think it's hard here to talk about the West as if it's a united bloc, because it's not. And how people have reacted to the war in Ukraine depends, I think, partly on their political views before the war, but also partly on where they are. And so the Baltic states, including Sweden and Norway and Denmark, have now become much more concerned about the Russian threat. And I think this is, you can see this. I mean, the fact that Sweden has abandoned neutrality, has joined NATO, Finland the same. I mean, this is a really important shift. And Poland too, I think. I mean, you know, Polish defense spending is now, I think, the highest of any NATO country. But not all Western nations feel the same. There are those, or certain peoples in those nations, who believe that it's better to try to come to terms with Russia, and better to sacrifice part of Ukraine, try to get some sort of peace. And so, unfortunately, the Western world is not united on this. And although I think it's not just geography, but I think the closer you are to Russia, perhaps the more you feel the threat. But having said that, I mean, the British have done what they can. They've sent a lot of support. The French have as well. And the Americans up till now, not always very, you know, sometimes not consistently, but the overall, the Americans have sent a lot of support, at least in the way of weapons, to Ukraine. So it does depend very much, I think, on the leadership, on the nature of the country, on how it defines its interests, and on geography. I think it is a very important war and a very important moment for the West. And I think if the West fails to support Ukraine properly, then I think this will cost the West in the long run, because it will encourage, you know, if people get away with aggression, it encourages others. We saw that before the Second World War, and we saw it before the First World War.
Yeah, thank you. And how do you see this global narrative around Ukraine and Russia developing in the future?
I don't know. It remains to be seen. Once the war is over, and wars do come to an end, then there will be the development of a narrative about it, which may not be truthful. We now live in an age. We've always lived in an age when we've always lived in a world where lies get told and conspiracy theories circulate. But we live in an age now where, thanks to social media, it is possible for all sorts of deliberate disinformation to be spread. And I think this is being used as a weapon by Russia and by others, and by self-appointed fanatics who like to spread stories which are not true. And so how the war will eventually be seen, I think, is a very, you know, it's a long-term question. What is clear, I think, is that it is already seen in different ways in the developed world and the developing world. The global South has not seen it as a war which really affects them and involves them. And I think that is a gulf which has become very apparent. And I think that's a real problem for the future, because I think it is very important for different parts of the world to agree on how they want to try and maintain peace and how they want to prevent aggression. And at the moment, unfortunately, for a lot of the global South, the West has lost its moral authority. Western involvement in Afghanistan, Western involvement in Iraq, has been seen by a lot of the global South as deeply destructive and not leading to better outcomes for those countries. And so there's a lot of rebuilding that will have to be done if we can get the leadership to do it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Thank you very much. And continuing this topic of global South and big alliances and different unions. So historically, wars often resulted in new political orders, whereas now we see that it's quite the opposite. So countries are separating, and the big alliances are fracturing. So how has this tendency evolved over time? And how do you see this war shaping the future of global alliances, particularly NATO and the European Union, and probably the broader international systems?
Well, I think what this war has done is put stress on an order that was already under stress. I think the international order was already under stress. You already had countries that were defying it. I mean, Russia's actions in Georgia, even before the invasion of Ukraine, and the earlier attempt to invade Ukraine. So I think that and take the seizure of Crimea. I mean, there were already things that were helping to break an international order. And I think we now face a real problem, is that the nation, the power that underpinned a lot of the international order, for better or worse, the United States, appears to want to withdraw from it. And it's not clear that there is a consortium of powers or any other single power that can take on that role of helping to maintain the international order. President Trump has made it clear that he wants to pull out of most international organizations. He's already pulled out of the World Health Organization. He's canceled, or appears to have canceled, US aid at tremendous cost to those peoples who were receiving it. And so what is going to emerge, I think, it's very difficult to tell. It's a bad time, I think, because we have a number of global problems, including aggression, which is not being punished, which will encourage others. But also, of course, we face the possibility of another pandemic. And we're already seeing the possibility of a new pandemic in the shape of bird flu, which has already put a few people in various countries in hospital and seems to be spreading. And of course, we face climate change. And so we face global issues without a global order that is capable of dealing with those. And that is, I think, very, very concerning.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you one more question about those aggressors and those violence not being punished. So you write in your book that if a country is strong enough, it can ensure peace in neighboring states. Yet we see in our situation that they've proven unable to secure this peace or to end the war on terms unfavorable for the aggressor. So we are still very grateful for allied nations for their help, for their support, and we understand that we are not like a part of big alliances. But why do you think that happened? Why is this statement not true in this case?
I think it's a question of will. Do you want to use your resources and your power and your armed forces to try and enforce peace? And I think increasingly those nations which have been prepared to do it don't want to do it anymore. The United States is tired, as it sees it, of being the world's policeman. And it hasn't always been a very good policeman. I think it left a mess in Iraq and it left a mess in Afghanistan. And I think there's a strong isolationist trend anyway in the United States that has been there. It's always been there. It seems to be surfacing again. China, I think, will pursue its own interests and when necessary will intervene to maintain order in its own particular way. But I don't see it well. And the European Union has really failed to come together as a cohesive international force. As for NATO, it's anyone's guess, I think. Will the United States pull out? It's a big question mark. We don't know. And if it does pull out, will the remaining NATO nations be able to rebuild NATO as a functioning organization? I mean, the trouble is, for so many decades now, the other members of NATO have relied on the United States. It's been the big power. They've relied on American force. They've relied on American equipment. They've relied on the United States to bail them out. And then if the United States suddenly pulls out, NATO and the countries which regard themselves as part of the West, including Japan, are going to have some very serious things to think about.
Yeah, thank you. So talking about continuing our talk about the big nations, big players. So we can see that China and the United States and the European Union, as you've already said, have been reacting differently to this war. So how does this war fit into global competition for influence?
Well, I think for the Chinese, they've been looking for influence, I think, for quite a long time now. And I think Xi Jinping has a vision of a China which is going to be respected. It's going to be a great global power, certainly, or if not a global power, certainly a regional power, a power in Asia, although his ambitions may go further than that. And so I think for China, I don't think the Chinese particularly wanted this war. I don't think they particularly supported this war, but it's useful for them to have Russia as an ally, and increasingly a dependent Russia, as I was saying earlier, that will do more and more, is likely to do more and more what China says. They also have had good relations with Iran, another of the nations that doesn't feel that the present global order suits it very well. Although at the moment Iran is on the back foot, it's lost a great deal of its influence with the destruction of Hezbollah and Hamas. So we'll see. But I think the Chinese would like to see their influence spread. They've been using financial diplomacy. They've been using investment diplomacy. They've been building ports and airfields and infrastructure generally all around the world. And it's very likely, for example, that they'll begin to do more in Latin America as the United States begins to cause trouble there or becomes less popular there. So it's a shifting international order, I think, very difficult to predict what is going to happen. I think a lot of outside powers would like to see the war in Ukraine end, but I'm not sure they're prepared to confront Russia on it. There is talk of a settlement. What the outlines of that will be, it seems to me, is not yet clear. Various people have suggested possible scenarios that Ukraine sacrifices part of the East, which is obviously something that the Ukrainians themselves would have a voice in. I mean, there's been too much talk of what happens without consulting Ukraine, and I think Ukraine has to be consulted. You're probably talking about it the whole time, and there's a talk of a frozen peace, as you have in Korea, where the war technically has not come to an end. It's just an armistice, and there's still military forces on both sides of the armistice line. So I think it remains to be seen. I mean, I think generally, apart from Russia, most powers would like to see the war over. But that may not necessarily be good for Ukraine, because they may be inclined to put pressure on Ukraine to accept a bad deal.
Yeah, unfortunately. But given this world order shifting and the rapid technical advancement, especially in warfare, and this hectic state our society is now in, how do you see the nature of war changing in the 21st century?
Well, I think we'll see a combination of types of war being fought, and you see it in Ukraine. I mean, there are pictures that come out of Ukraine that look very much like pictures from the First World War, with trenches, or the Second World War with fighting through towns and cities, house to house fighting. But what, of course, we have now are drones, which is the very rapid adaptation of civilian technology to war, quicker, I think, than most people expected. And the big question mark for me is artificial intelligence. And we're now looking at the very rapid development of artificial intelligence. There is already work being done on autonomous weapon systems that will be self-guiding, that will make their own decisions. And what is very concerning is, at what point is there any human intervention? And so far, the powers that are in the lead of developing artificial intelligence applications for war do not want any international treaties on this. There have been discussions, but so far no clear agreements have been reached, because I think each country developing artificial intelligence for war is trying to develop it quickly for its own benefit and doesn't want controls. And that, I think, is very worrying indeed, because there will be a point. I mean, already those who help to develop artificial intelligence don't really know how it works. It's got beyond their capacity to understand it. And I've heard people who were involved in the development of artificial intelligence. I've read interviews and I've heard them talk about this, that it is something that is now getting out of their control. And I think that's absolutely terrifying for war.
Yeah, life in the 21st century can get very interesting sometimes. Yeah, thank you. We are getting to our last block of questions, and I will also like to ask you a question from one of your publishers, Ukrainian publishing house Laboratoria. And so they asked what historical parallels do you see between Russian-Ukrainian war and other wars in the past, and what lessons from these conflicts can help us build more resilient international relations in future.
Well, I suppose that it's a bit like the First World War and a bit like the Second World War, that in both wars, I think people making the plans thought that attack would work. They thought the offensive would work. And what we learned in those wars, the power of the defense can be very strong. That Germany made great strides into Russia, the Soviet Union, in 1941 when it invaded. And then that invasion came to a halt as the size of Russia and the determination of the Russians to fight on shattered the German armed forces. And I think Russia discovered the same thing when it invaded and occupied Ukraine, that defense can be very strong indeed, and it can be very costly for those who are attacking. And so I think if we look at earlier wars, we can see the importance of understanding the defense and how effective it can be. But history never repeats itself exactly. You know, there's different technologies, different ways of fighting, different situations. But one thing I would say that is very important in fighting a war is the morale of not just those fighting, but the morale of the civilian population as well. And no war effort can be sustained for any length of time if you don't have support of the public, and if you don't have good morale among those who are actually doing the fighting. It's critical. And so some things never change in war, I think. Some things do.
Yeah, thank you for such a great answer. So many nations have emerged stronger from wars, though, as we already said, at great cost. And historically, wars often led to state building and national identity formations. So what lessons from history can Ukraine apply to ensure its successful post-war recovery? And how do you see it influencing our national identity?
I think it is one of the curious things about war, and it's a very uncomfortable thing to reflect on, that war does sometimes bring positive changes in societies. And I think what you had coming out of the First and Second World Wars was a recognition by governments in many countries on both sides, those who won and those who lost, that those who had fought, but equally important, or perhaps even more important, the civilian population should be looked after, that it should not be rewarded, but that it should live in a better world. And so in Britain, for example, during the First World War, even before the end of the war, women and the working classes were given the vote. They hadn't participated in politics before, and this was a really significant change. What also happened after the Second World War is a number of countries introduced social programs, increased pensions, increased benefits, because there was a recognition that without the civilians, the war could not have been fought and been won. And what happened, and this was partly a result of the war as well, because the rich were taxed to help pay for the war, and because those who were at the bottom rungs of society, the bottom levels of society, were treated even during the war better. They got better food, they got better pay, that there was less division in society because there was less polarization, that you didn't have a small group of very, very rich people who didn't pay much in the way of taxes and a lot of people who didn't share in the benefits of society. And so war can bring greater equality, it can bring advanced social benefits. And I think it's very important for governments to remember that. And what I think citizens want is an improvement. They want an improvement in their lives, but they also want good government. I think they want governments that respond to democratic wishes. I think they want governments that deal with issues like corruption. I think this is very important. And this can often be one of the, as I say, uncomfortable though it is, this can often be one of the benefits of wars, that people look more critically at their own societies and their own governments and try and think how they should be changed.
Yeah, thank you. I think we are also experiencing this. We now feel that society can actually influence something, and that the government will respond. So when there are some, I don't know, strange laws or something like that, we have this societal reaction, and it actually works. So yeah, it's a very frustrating thing to accept, that war also can bring something better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You wouldn't choose to do it that way. The costs of
Yeah.
war are too high. But
Yeah,
it's a
for
bit,
sure.
it's a bit like the crisis of the COVID pandemic. It did bring some things that were better. It did, as societies responded, it did bring, I think, a greater willingness of people to help each other. Not everywhere, but I think it did make a difference.
Yeah. And talking about national identity, I would also like to ask you about the importance of commemoration. So in your book, you mentioned that it's one of the key aspects of forming a united nation. Ukrainians, however, never truly had a chance to honor their heroes. Instead, we were made to honor some Soviet figures. And how do you think this influenced us? And do you think we now should seek common heroes for forming this national unity?
I don't think you can create it artificially. You saw what happened when you had Soviet heroes imposed on you. They were not welcomed, and they did not become part of Ukrainian nationality. I think a lot of it should come from the bottom up. It should be what people choose to commemorate. I mean, governments can play a certain part, but after the First World War, and again after the Second World War, in the countries that had fought it, in Britain again, for example, often the memorials were put up by local communities. And I am all for letting people choose who they want to remember. That doesn't mean that, you don't want sort of mad far right or far left groups deciding that they will commemorate in a provocative way peoples who are not heroes. But I do think it has to be something that spreads through society. You don't want governments imposing heroes from the top. And I think how you commemorate is important. It will change over time. I think it changes over time. And at first, the commemorations in Europe after the two world wars were very much national commemorations. And increasingly, as the time went by, you got international commemorations where former enemies came together to try and commemorate a tragedy that happened to them both. So, but I think we leave it partly, we leave it, I think we should leave it to public opinion and what the public wants.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we now have a lot of people who died and who became these new heroes for us. So yeah, probably that's the public is gonna, I don't know, be united in that matter. Yeah. Yeah, and one more question from me. So wars can alter societies on deep psychological levels, and we experience it ourselves. And so what impact do you think it is having on Ukrainian society, and what challenges may rise during the post-war recovery, and considering the fact that we are still in war? And how long could it take us to deal with that trauma? I know that this question is quite hard to answer, but maybe based on your knowledge of previous wars and conflicts, maybe you can give us some kind of insight.
There's such a range of reactions, and I think at the end of a war, a lot of people just want to forget it. It's a very common phenomenon that those who have fought in a war don't want to talk about it. And I think that is understandable. And there are those who do want to talk about it. And there will be those who need psychological counseling. I mean, there will be a whole range of reactions. And I think the important thing at the end of any wars is to try and make it possible for those reactions to come out. And I think recriminations, searching for those who those who perhaps searching for those who didn't support the war effort enough, that can be very damaging for a society. I think in France, after the Second World War, because so many French had collaborated with the Nazis, there was a very bad period where the French were divided among themselves, and it's understandable. How you deal with that, I think, is very difficult, but it will be up to the Ukrainians to deal with it. I think it's your problem. And I suppose all I can say is that being able to talk about it, being able to discuss it without treating each other as criminals will be important. I mean, there may be those that you consider worthy of punishment, and that certainly happened in France. I mean, there were trials of some of the people who, well, including Marshal Pétain, who'd been the head of the Vichy government. There were trials held, and that also was important. But it will be up to society. But I think how you deal with it will be very much a matter for Ukrainians.
Yeah, thank you. And I have my last question, but it's not actually mine. It's one of the members of our community. He asked it beforehand, and I liked it very much, so I decided to include it in this interview. So in your book, there is a quote that war is not only a crime against humanity, but it's also a punishment for crime. So how will you explain this idea, and can this quote be applied to Ukraine and to this current war? And another question is, if you had written your book after February 24th, 2022, is there anything you would change there?
I think what the quotation means, and it's from a very good novelist, a very good writer, is that war is a crime, but it grows out of our nature. It grows out of humanity itself, and that we have to face that. Unless we face the fact that we are capable of committing the crime of war, then we won't be able properly to deal with it. You know, we can't just throw up our hands and say, well, it's those people over there who fight wars. We're not like that. Oh, yes, we are, and we have been, and we can be. And so I think we have to accept that there is a design flaw, if you like, in humanity, that we still think that war can be something where we can gain something by. I mean, I make a distinction. Aggressive wars, I think, are never right. Wars of defense are, because those fighting the defensive war have no choice. You know, it's a threat to their whole existence, and I think they have no choice often but to fight. If I was writing my book after the invasion and occupation, I would be saying much more about Ukraine, because Ukraine, the whole motivation behind the occupation, behind the invasion, the ways in which the war was fought, have made me and of course all of us think again about the nature of war. And I think I would have used it as examples of a very present war. And I would have been fascinated, as I have been, by the ways in which Ukraine responded so quickly, and the very quick adaptation of technology, which is, you know, again, there are examples of it all through history, but I would have, I think, had much more to say about that.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you very much for this interview. Thank you for such full and complete answers, and thank you for your book. I had a great pleasure reading it. So we are done with my part of the interview. I think we can have a round of applause to you, Margaret. Thank you for being here with us. And now we are moving to our Q&A session from our listeners. So as you know, the publishing house Laboratoria has given us 3 books, and you can win these books for asking your questions to Margaret. And you can raise your hand and ask your question, or you can write it in, you can put it in our chat, and I will read it. Preferably you write it in English, but it can also be in Ukrainian, so I can translate it. So if you have any questions, please raise your hands. but this was kind of big interview, so I don't know, maybe there are no questions left.
Well, you asked very good questions, so thank you
Oh,
very
thank
much.
you.
We covered a lot of territory.
Yeah, thank you.
And perhaps I suspect people are wanting to go and have some lunch.
Yeah, and I see Otto, so the last question was from him actually. So he's here.
Thank you, Margaret. Yes, it's Marta translate my questions that I stay on Ukrainian, but maybe I have a question about we expected, Ukrainian expected some punish of this crime, yes, and how you think what it will be what would be what this our expected how it managing of this this punish of this feeling our punish I'm sorry for my
No, it's very clear, and thank you. The question will be how to get those who are guilty or who are being charged with these crimes. And I know Ukraine and other organizations, international organizations have been collecting evidence of war crimes, and I think have been doing so right from the beginning. And so there must be a very good collection of evidence. The problem always is to get those, who have committed the crimes. And of course, Putin on downwards are not going to surrender themselves to any international court. I mean, they simply will ignore it. But I think in the keeping of the record, I think there will be punishment of a sort. And there will be a punishment for the Russian people who are not necessarily directly responsible, but whose society committed these crimes. And it will be known. It's like, the crimes of the Nazis were not punished very much. A few people were tried, but not all that many. And the top Nazis somehow, a lot escaped to places like South America or committed suicide. But I think the German people as a whole has borne an historical burden as a result of the very complete and full record of the crimes that were committed in the Holocaust. And this is not much consolation, I think, for Ukrainians, but I think the fact that these crimes will be known and have been documented is important. And I suppose the minor punishment that those responsible in Russia for some of these crimes will not be able to travel abroad may make their lives a little bit more difficult. We would like to see them properly tried and convicted, but I somehow doubt that is going to happen, much as we would like it to happen. And thank you for your earlier question too.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Otto. So I think everybody is hungry indeed. Yeah, and I see some comments in chat that the listeners are very grateful for this conversation, and I'm very grateful as well. And thank you very much. It was a very pleasant conversation, and I hope maybe someday we'll have another conversation like this, talking about how we manage to deal with everything. Yeah, and thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Marta, and thank you all. One day we may talk about peace, which would be nice. But thank you.
Yeah, that would be really nice. Yeah, have a great day. Have a great spring.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much, and it was a pleasure, and I wish you well for 2025.
Thank you. We wish you well as well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.